The honourable member from Vancouver East.
Today is National Housing Day. The NDP demanded immediate action to stop housing profiteering, a non-profit acquisition fund, and major funding and below-market financing for social and community housing in the fall economic statement. But the Minister of Finance failed to deliver. By delaying the funds to NDP key housing measures for another 2 years, makes the Liberals claim that they want to see more homes built faster a joke. It undermines the Bank of Canada's view that housing investment is not inflationary spending, but can even drive down the high cost of living. The fall economic statement also offered nothing new to support women, seniors, veterans, and Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Canadians don't have to choose between the Liberals, who just disappoints, or the Conservatives, who think building social housing and co-ops is a Soviet-style takeover of housing. New Democrats will at least double Canada's community housing stock and put a stop to housing profiteering. It is time for Ottawa to work for everyday people and not just wealthy CEOs.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, the dreariness of November is being replaced in Quebec by a colourful celebration in our image. November in Quebec is Social Economy Month. It's an opportunity to celebrate all of the businesses that make up our economic fabric. Quebecers all have their favourite non-profit. Just about everyone is member of a co-op. We all know a great mutual. We trust these local businesses that give meaning to the economy, whether for their workers, artisans, or consumers. And with good reason. The social economy is all about having business acumen and also knowing how to share success, leaving no one behind. Our social economy includes Valspec, Jardin de la Résistance, Créaction, Co-op C'est Sûr, and the Écolocal Market. It's also Coup de Pouce des Moissons and the Lac Saint-François National Wildlife Area. For the Bloc Québécois, the social economy is above all a source of pride. Happy Social Economy Month.
The honourable member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
Yesterday's false hopes update can be summed up as prices up, rents up, photo ops up, taxes up, time's up. Conservatives will be voting no confidence in this Prime Minister's fall economic statement because he's not worth the cost. Liberal NDP spending caused 40-year highs in inflation and the most rapid interest rate hikes in Canadian history, putting Canadians most at risk in the G7 for a mortgage default crisis. And after 8 years, the only housing measure they had in there was to change the housing department's name. 2 million Canadians are going to a food bank in a single month, yet the Prime Minister still plans to quadruple his carbon tax scam on gas, groceries, and home heating. A common-sense Conservative government will bring home lower prices by axing the carbon tax scam, bringing home powerful paychecks by balancing the budget so interest rates and inflation can come down, and bringing homes Canadians can actually afford by incentivizing municipalities to build, build, build. A common-sense Conservative leader will turn hurt into hope for all Canadians. Now let's bring it home.
The Honourable Member for Gatineau.
Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to the member for Cardigan, to Francis and the entire Macaulay family. He is a man who has served his constituents and all Canadians with honour, wisdom, good humour, decency, and just plain common sense. This week, he is celebrating the 35th anniversary of his first election to this House. He has won 11 consecutive elections, Mr. Speaker, and it is no surprise why. He was first born in St. Peter's Bay in Prince Edward Island, and he's never forgotten where he came from. The good people of PEI clearly know this. He's an islander to the core. Before entering politics, he worked as a farmer and a businessman, and among his many roles in cabinet, he served as Solicitor General, Minister of Labour, Minister of Veterans Affairs, and on two separate occasions as Minister of Agriculture.
I'd like to thank him for the many years he has served Canada.
All fortunate that this islander came our way 35 years ago. The Liberal Party, this House, and Canada are better for it, Mr. Speaker.
Questions orales. Oral questions. L'honorable chef de
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, we've just heard reports in the media about a terrorist attack at the border at Niagara Falls. 2 people may be dead, and a third is wounded. Can the Prime Minister give us any information about that terrorist attack? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this is a very serious situation at the Niagara border. A vehicle blew up on the Rainbow Bridge. We're still talking to the authorities about it, and the Americans, our border service officers, the RCMP, and so on. I was contacted by the Minister of Public Safety. We're trying to gather all the information. We're providing support. We're talking to the Americans. I can confirm that the border has been closed down at the Queenstown, Peace, Rainbow, and another bridge. Additional security measures are being brought to all border crossings all across the country. It's a very serious situation, but we will remain engaged for the entire day.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we've just heard media reports of a terrorist attack, an explosion at the Niagara crossing of the Canada-U.S. border. At least two people are dead, one is injured. It is the principal responsibility of government to protect the people. Can the Prime Minister give us an update on what he knows and what action plan he will immediately implement to bring home security for our people?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is obviously a very serious situation in Niagara Falls. There was a vehicle explosion at the Rainbow Bridge crossing. I've been briefed by the NSIA and the Minister of Public Safety. CBSA, RCMP, and Transport Canada are all fully engaged in providing the necessary support. There are a lot of questions, and we are following up to try and get as many answers as rapidly as possible. We are in close contact with U.S. officials, and we'll continue to work closely with them. We will continue to be engaged. We will provide updates. Updates I can give right now is there are 4 border crossings that are right now closed: Rainbow Bridge, Whirlpool Bridge, Queenston Bridge, and Peace Bridge. Additional measures are being contemplated and activated at all border crossings across the country. We are taking this extraordinarily seriously, and Mr. Speaker, I will have to excuse myself now to go get further updates and work on this very serious situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Chef de l'Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. After all experts warned this government that its spending was causing inflation to rise, the government spent another $20 billion. That means tax increases, inflation up, interest rates up, rents up, mortgage payments up. Will the government finally reverse its inflationary policies so that Canadians who have record mortgage payments to make so that they can save their houses, keep their houses?
L'Honourable Ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, yesterday was a good day with good news for people wanting to buy a new home because there were measures in the fall economic statement that will provide for the construction of thousands of homes all across the country and more rental units through the purpose-built rental building program. And there's good news for households, for Canadians, and for everyone who's interested in having an affordable life here in Canada.
Leader of the Opposition.
What's up? Rent's up. Rates are up. Taxes up, debt up, time's up for this government, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years, they're not worth the cost. And now this Prime Minister cakes on another $20 billion of inflationary spending and will bring up the interest payments on our debt to a record-smashing $51 billion a year. With 2 million Canadians eating at a food bank every month and many facing the loss of their home. Why won't they cancel this inflationary scam and replace it with a plan to balance the budget and bring down interest rates and inflation?
Mr. Speaker, yesterday's fall economic statement demonstrates the next phase in our plan to make sure that we have an economy that works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, the International Monetary Fund is predicting that Canada's growth will lead the G7 in 2024. We have the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio in the G7. And, Mr. Speaker, while we are building housing, while we are moving on with our clean tax credits, while we are making sure that adoptive parents can have the benefits that they need, you know what's up, Mr. Speaker? The end of support for the Conservative Party for Ukrainians in this country and in Ukraine as the Conservatives vote against the Canada-Ukraine free trade deal. Shame on them.
Chef de l'opposition.
Actually, what's up is that the Prime Minister has once again betrayed Ukraine. He betrayed Ukraine when he gave Putin that big turbine to pump his gas and fund his war. He betrayed Ukraine when he refused to sell Canadian gas to break European dependence on Putin. He betrayed Ukraine by failing to vet someone celebrated in this House who turned out to be a Nazi. And he's betraying Ukraine with this terrible agreement to force a carbon tax on Ukrainians that will destroy their ability to fight a war and rebuild their economy. We will axe the tax and stand unequivocally with Ukrainians in their fight for freedom.
I'll ask the member from St. Albert, Edmonton, to please restrain himself. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if that were true, the members of the opposition would have voted in favor of the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, an agreement that I will note the government of Ukraine asked Canada to do with them in a time of their utmost need when they're facing an illegal war of aggression from Russia. But instead of supporting Ukrainians in their time of need, instead of truly stand up for their fight for freedom, they vote against it on a red herring. Mr. Speaker, Canadians need to ask what the Conservatives are doing, and there's only one party that's betrayed Ukraine, and that's the Conservatives. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, allow me to express the hope that the situation at the border will be as non-dramatic as it can possibly be, especially under the current circumstances. Yesterday, the government issued its fall economic statement with all kinds of pomp and ceremony, but the box was empty. Businesses are being let down, seniors are being let down, and the homeless are being let down. Are we to understand that things are going to get worse before they get better, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize my honourable colleague. We too are very concerned by the situation at the border, and we will be monitoring the situation closely. When it comes to yesterday's fall economic statement, it's clear that we're going to continue our partnership with the Government of Quebec. We're going to spend $900 million, together with our $900 million, for housing. And it's also very important, Mr. Speaker, because tax credits for the green economy are very important to Quebec. And the statement of yesterday's statement is good for Quebec, it's good for Canada, it's good for everyone. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, for 2 years now, they've been trotting out that same $900 million. It wasn't news in yesterday's statement, and that answer just shows how vacuous the statement was. My question was, they're creating a minister for infrastructure and communities. That's the Department of Intrusion and Incompetence. It's it's interference with Quebec's jurisdiction. Could this government at least stop interfering? The Honourable Minister of Housing. Mr. Speaker, as members know full well, it's a pleasure to cooperate with Quebec City, with my provincial counterpart in Quebec. We have a deal, $900 million from the federal government and the same amount from Quebec City. This deal will allow for 23,000 more housing units. It's an opportunity to cooperate, and I will continue my work building housing in Quebec and all across the country. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, I want to express my deep concern about the incident that we're just learning about at the Rainbow Bridge crossing between Canada and the United States. I want to acknowledge the work of the first responders, and we want to express also our deep concern for those reports that indicate that those that may be injured and potentially fatalities as well. Our deep concern about that. We want to know what's the update in terms of Canada's assistance in the investigation and the other steps to support those that have been impacted.
The Honourable House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question. We are deeply concerned about what we have all learned recently happened at the Peace Bridge between Canada and the United States. As the Prime Minister mentioned, this happened very recently. He and the Minister of Public Safety are being updated as we speak. We will share information with the House and indeed with all Canadians as we get more information. But at this time, we do want to express our deep condolences to the people and the families who have lost loved ones, and we will continue to be engaged in this very serious and worrisome manner. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South. Yesterday, if you wanted to hear the Prime Minister talk about his plan to make life more affordable, you had to pay $1,700 or $850 for those under 35. $850 for him to tell young people who are struggling to afford their rent, wait 2 years more for affordable housing. Why does the Prime Minister think it's acceptable to make people wait 2 years for affordable housing?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am thankful for the opportunity, the Honourable Member, to raise affordable housing in young people. So many young people are taking advantage of the First Home Savings Account. Just the other day, I was talking to a young woman in my riding. She and her partner have saved, done so with tax-free savings, and just moved into their first home. And there's an uptick on this, Mr. Speaker. More and more young people are able to do this, and it's changing a lot of lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister, after 8 years, isn't worth the cost, and he promised that the additional debt would never cost anything because interest rates were low. But now we understand that the amount the federal government will spend next year on the interest on the debt has doubled. It's up to $52 billion. That is more than we spend on health and twice what we spend on the military. Why is the Prime Minister taking this money away from soldiers and nurses to give it to bankers? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we tabled our economic statement that shows the very solid foundations of our economy. But I'd like to come back to what the Conservative leader himself is proposing, because the Conservatives' austerity plan doesn't speak to Quebecers. It doesn't speak to Canadians. I'd like to understand why he refuses to answer the question about where he's going to cut. Is he going to cut assistance to seniors? Is he going to cut support for families and children? Is he going to cut dental care? That's what Canadians want to know.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, as the Prime Minister was doubling our national debt, adding more debt than all previous 22 Prime Ministers combined. He claimed there'd be no cost because interest rates, he said, were low. But those low interest rates are gone and the debt is still here. Yesterday we learned that interest on the debt has gone up by over 100% to $52.4 billion. That's more than the $52.1 billion we spend on health care and double what we spend on the military. So why is the Prime Minister taking money from nurses and soldiers and giving it to bankers and bondholders?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we tabled the fall economic update, which shows the solid foundations of our fiscal frame and also shows that we were able to maintain that fiscal responsibility while being compassionate and being there for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We're building more homes and we're building them faster. We're changing competition laws in order to stabilize prices in this country. And Mr. Speaker, what the Conservatives are proposing are cuts, is austerity. Right. They want to claw back the supports to families, claw back supports to our seniors, Mr. Speaker. That is not what Canadians need, and that is not what Canadians deserve.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Fear and falsehoods are the only thing they can use to distract from their disastrous record. Mr. Speaker, they are the ones clawing back from seniors and from families with their quadrupling of the carbon tax. For the first time in Canadian history, we have 7 million people who are skipping meals because they can't afford to eat, and 2 million people, a record-smashing number, are now eating at food banks. There is a common-sense solution, which is the Conservative Bill C-234 to take taxes off the farmers who feed us. Will the Prime Minister back down again, stop fighting this common sense bill, and stop taxing our farmers so that our people can afford to eat?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are the government that decided that the retirement age should go back to 65, not 67, which was a decision that side of the House decided to make while their leader was in Davos, Switzerland. But let's stay in Europe for 1 second, Mr. Speaker, and talk about the appalling decision by these so-called conservatives to turn down a free trade agreement with a beacon of democracy like Ukraine. What is up with that party? That's what Canadians want to know. And this carbon tax excuse, no one's buying. What's up, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the pathological obsession these Liberals have with carbon taxes has now reached a level where it is sick. This is how sick they are on the carbon tax. That they would use Ukraine's vulnerability in the middle of the war to impose their destructive carbon tax on the people of Ukraine and make it harder for them to rebuild after the war. We already know this Prime Minister was used as a Russian propaganda tool when he brought a Nazi into the House of Commons. Why is he trying to damage the Ukrainian economy with a destructive carbon tax in this terrible deal?
The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
The only ones who are not supporting Ukraine are the Conservatives. Let's be clear. The Canada-Ukraine free trade deal does not impose a price on pollution on Ukraine. And you know why? Because Ukraine already has a price on pollution.
I bet you knew that already, right, James?
We're here to support them because the Conservatives are not.
That's right.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, if it was already there, they wouldn't have needed to put it in the deal. We negotiated the free trade deal with Ukraine. We support free trade with Ukraine. We're the only party that supports a real trade agreement with Ukraine that would include supplying it with Canadian-made defense equipment, which they voted against yesterday. They voted against that yesterday. They voted against supplying Ukraine with clean Canadian energy that would repower their economy. So let's get this straight. They're against giving or selling Canadian munitions to fight the Russian attackers, but they're in favor of imposing a carbon tax on Ukrainians. That's nuts, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister for The Honourable Minister for International Development.
Mr. Speaker, it was bad enough that this party is the only party in this House that doesn't believe in climate change, that doesn't believe in fighting the good fight against climate change. But on top of that now, when Ukrainians are dying literally on behalf of freedom-loving people of the world, they're fighting fascism, they're fighting totalitarianism, they're fighting against an illegal invasion. At that critical moment, what did they choose to do? They chose to abandon Ukrainians in their hour of need. Mr. President, Canadians will remember this moment, and we will never forget this shameful party.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it really is a pathological obsession for a party not only to look at its starving people, the 2 million people in Canada that have to go to food banks every month, the 7 million people who are hungry in Canada, but then to say that the misery from their carbon tax is not enough here in Canada, that they need to export it by imposing it in a pre-existing trade agreement. Mr. Speaker, when I'm Prime Minister, we will have a real free trade agreement with Ukraine that helps them win and rebuild, but has no carbon tax. We will axe the tax here and make sure anyone in the world who wants to axe the tax has the freedom to do it.
The Honourable Minister. Colleagues. I know it is Wednesday. I know that we've all come from our caucuses. I need to ask members to please exercise self-restraint so that the Speaker can hear the question and hear the answers. The Honourable Minister for Justice and Attorney General for Canada.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday when the vote was happening on the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, I was actually sitting with the Ambassador of Ukraine and Ukraine's Prosecutor General. We were talking about the pressing needs of the Ukrainian people and how we address those pressing needs and address their concerns in their hour of need. For the past 18 months, I was pleased to say that we had had a multi-partisan approach to addressing Ukraine. Unfortunately, that evaporated in a puff of smoke with a very decided and methodical vote taken on the behalf of the Conservatives. When we say on the side that we stand with Ukraine, we mean it. And when we say Slava Ukraini, we mean it even more.
Then I have
the Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, it's quite fascinating. I ask a question about the fall economic statement, and I get a 2-year-old announcement. And that shows that there was nothing in the economic statement. So why do one? When I was young, people said, if you have nothing to say, shut up. So what is the government, what do they have to say to seniors who are having trouble affording groceries? What are they saying to municipalities that are having trouble housing people? They're going to create a department with a longer, more expensive, more complicated title? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, our fall economic statement, which was tabled yesterday, invests more in our housing co-ops in Quebec and all across Canada. We're strengthening and fighting against rentals like Airbnb because we know that Quebec has local regulations that are very strict, and we want to support that. We also know that there are families that are still having trouble making ends meet, and that's why we are amending the Competition Act. That's concrete action for you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, we didn't need an economic statement to get answers like that, especially because now, between now and 2026, when the money is going to flow, there's no guarantee that that money will still be there by then. So what was the whole point of this exercise other than to make us waste our time? Businesses, seniors, and homeless people are just as in distress today as they were yesterday. Why waste Parliament's time? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I think my colleague is having a hard time understanding the purpose of an economic statement. It's not a budget, Mr. Speaker. It's an economic statement. It's because we want to be transparent with Canadians and we want to show where we're at with our plan. Yesterday, we also announced that we would be removing the GST on psychotherapy and that we were going to fight against homelessness. So there are measures that will help Canadians also. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Our food banks, that if you put the images in black and white, you would just assume you were looking at images from the Great Depression. We have never seen 2 million people going to a food bank in a month. Never has had 7 million people eating less than is healthy. But that is the starvation that we have as a result of 8 years of this Prime Minister. There's a common sense Conservative bill, C-234, that is passed to the Senate. The Prime Minister's ministers are panicking and begging senators to block it. Will the Prime Minister tell his senators that they have go-ahead to pass this common sense Conservative bill so our farmers can feed our people?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You'd think after 2 decades in this place, the member opposite might know that the Senate is independent of this place. However, there was a time when Canadians could look to Conservatives for a little bit of leadership on fighting climate change. Mr. Speaker, Brian Mulroney was a
Colleagues, please. I had trouble hearing the honourable member, so I'm going to ask the honourable member to start again from the top so that I can hear. Please, honourable members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, you'd think after 2 decades working here, and no other job before that, I might add, that the member opposite, leader of the Conservative Party, would know that the Senate is independent of this place. And you know, there was also a time, Mr. Speaker, when Canadians could look to the Conservatives for a little bit of leadership on climate action, back when Brian Mulroney led the fight against climate change, and when my neighbour, the member from Wellington Halton Hills, staked his entire leadership campaign on a carbon price. Now the leader of the Conservative Party is using climate action as a wedge to justify their vote, shameful vote, against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine already prices carbon, and they're out of air.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the member's comedy routine won't make up for the fact that Canadians cannot afford to feed themselves. But the Prime Minister is in a bind again. He was already bullied by his Atlantic caucus into panicking and bringing in a temporary pause on home heating taxes, but only for some. Now, his Environment Minister is threatening to resign if there are any more carbon tax carve-outs. Will the Prime Minister stop allowing himself to be bullied and threatened by his radical Environment Minister and axe the tax on our farmers so that Canadians can afford to eat?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, much, Mr. Speaker. The only thing radical in this House is the leader of the Conservatives Party constant climate denial, Mr. Speaker. As I just mentioned, the Conservatives are trying to use climate denial in an attempt to justify their shameful vote against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement yesterday. But I have news for the Conservatives. Ukraine already prices carbon, along with other European countries like Norway, Sweden, Great Britain, Denmark, Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Poland, Switzerland. A lot of them believe in pricing carbon, Mr. Speaker. They all ran on that promise, and the member from Wellington Alton Hills staked his entire leadership campaign on it, Mr. Speaker. Get with the program, Conservatives.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Their program is hunger and homelessness for Canadians. Right. Fortunately, we have a common sense Conservative solution which would take the carbon tax off of our farmers. The tax they want to quadruple. But the Prime Minister is in a panic because his Environment Minister says, and I quote, "As long as I am the Environment Minister, there will be no more exemptions to the carbon pricing," end quote. In other words, if this bill passes, his Minister of Environment will resign. Why won't the Prime Minister simply accept the Minister's resignation now and let this bill pass so Canadians can feed themselves?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians know what it means when they hear the words common sense Conservatives. It means cuts to the programs and the services that they rely on that ultimately hurt Canadians. But let's put some facts on the table, Mr. Speaker. Since we've come into office in 2015, we've lifted 650,000 children, 2.7 million Canadians out of poverty. Canada now ranks 6th in terms of where we rank in terms of child poverty in the world. When the Conservatives were in office, when that leader was in office, Mr. Speaker, Canada ranked 24th in the world when it came to child poverty. Mr. Speaker, we continue to support Canadians. We'll stay on the facts, and we will not cut services like the Conservatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
No, what they're doing is cutting the food budgets of families by raising the tax on the farmers who feed us. Again, there is a common sense Conservative bill that passed through this House of Commons against the great protest of the Prime Minister, who still wants to quadruple the tax. We're simply asking him to tell his Environment Minister to resign and let his Liberal-appointed ministers pass the bill. So, what will he pick? Will he pick allowing Canadians to feed their families around the kitchen table, or will he keep his crazy Environment Minister around the cabinet table?
Order. I'd like to remind all members that it's important to use language which is, when it's directed at a particular member, language that is not disruptive or demeaning. I will ask the Honourable Minister to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll happily tell the Leader of the Opposition what we pick on this side. Mr. Speaker, we pick to support Canadians in their time of need. Mr. Speaker, we pick to fight climate change, Mr. Speaker, which we know is an existential threat. And we pick to ensure that we are supporting people who are seeking their freedom around the world, Mr. Speaker. What we're seeing in the United States is right-wing politicians who are turning away from Ukraine, turning towards Russia. I can only assume that's what we're seeing here in Canada right now, as the members opposite are the only ones in Canada who are not standing with Ukraine. Canadians stands with Ukraine, and everyone else except for the Conservative Party does.
Order. The Honourable Member from Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fall economic statement missed the mark on addressing the housing crisis facing Indigenous people. According to the last census, over 300,000 Indigenous people are not living in suitable housing, and approximately the same number are living in buildings that need major repair. After 8 years of Liberals, they have neglected and ignored the strife and the struggle of Indigenous people and a delayed action on housing crisis. What is the Prime Minister's excuse?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Communities and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sincerely thankful for the NDP's concern for the well-being of Indigenous people across Canada and for the recognition of the need to continue to make the investments necessary to improve the housing situation impacting communities in every part of this country. The reality, though, Mr. Speaker, is that we are making historic investments in affordable housing for Canadians generally, but specifically for Indigenous peoples across this country as well. In previous budgets, we have put $4 billion on the table for distinction-based funding for Indigenous communities, and an additional $4.3 billion to address Indigenous housing needs in urban, rural, and northern environments across this country. We'll continue to do what's necessary to support Indigenous peoples when it comes to housing.
The Honourable Member from Burnaby South.
The Prime Minister promised Canadians in 2021 he would impose an emissions cap on oil and gas producers. It's been 2 years of delay and disappointment. Families, municipalities, small businesses, and in the industrial sectors are investing in low-carbon solutions. But oil and gas emissions continue to rise unchecked. That doesn't look like climate leadership to me. Will the Prime Minister commit to releasing the oil and gas emissions cap framework with a 2030 target in line with science before COP28?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Burnaby South, the leader of the New Democratic Party. It's refreshing to talk about how we fight climate change and not if we fight climate change, constantly with the Conservatives debating whether or not climate change even exists. I agree with the Speaker, with the leader of the NDP, Mr. Speaker. Establishing a cap on oil and gas emissions is one of the key commitments of our government's emissions reductions plan. Canada's oil and gas companies have proven repeatedly that they can innovate and develop new technologies and more competitive business models, and will continue to work with them on reducing their emissions with an emissions cap. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the government announced new measures that will support homeowners, the middle class, and increase housing construction. All measures that Conservatives will vote against, just as they voted against cutting taxes on the middle class and opposing any investment in affordable housing. In fact, the Conservatives eliminated 800,000 affordable homes the last time they were in government. Canadians know the only thing they can count on is that the Conservatives will abandon them in their time of need, just as our brave Ukrainian allies found out yesterday. So can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance please tell Canadians why the Conservative Party should instead change course and support the measures in the fall economic statement?
Good question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his excellent question. Yesterday, we did table the fall economic statement, which is the next step in our plan to build more homes right across this country and to build them faster, Mr. Speaker, to crack down on short-term rentals and Airbnbs by supporting municipalities and their own regulations, and of course by strengthening competition laws in this country in order to stabilize prices. Mr. Speaker, that was our plan, and it took only minutes for the Conservative leader to call it disgusting. What is actually disgusting is that Conservative leader refuses to tell Canadians what he's going to cut.
That's right.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
It's come to light that the Prime Minister will spend $15 billion tax dollars, that's $1,000 for every single family in Canada, on a grant that will pay for 1,600 replacement workers to come in and displace union jobs in Windsor in a battery plant there, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Prime Minister's desperately claiming that he had no choice in the matter. Well, then why doesn't he open up the contract so all Canadians can see if there were any guarantees that this massive $15 billion grant would actually lead to Canadian and not foreign paychecks?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is a little bit rich coming from a political party that not only doesn't stand for auto workers, doesn't stand for Canadian workers at all, has no interest in a green economic plan like we have. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives have not been with workers. They've not been with the auto sector. We are building battery plants in parts of this country. We are building and the green economic plan, Mr. Speaker, Let's look at the facts. 1, temporary foreign worker permit has been approved. 1.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, and there are 1,599 more, at least, in foreign replacement workers who will be coming to use the 15 billion tax dollars that this Prime Minister is making Canadians pay for this single plant. In fact, here I have the advertisements for the position: electric quality mode engineer, skills required, bilingual in English or Korean. Wow. Mr. Speaker, this is true of countless of the job applications. Will the Prime Minister release the contract on this $15 billion deal to see if any of the money is going to go to Canadian workers, or it's all going to foreign replacement workers?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workforce Development.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the official opposition's misinformation cannot hide the transformational nature of this investment and investments like it across the country. Let's be extremely clear and focused on the facts, Mr. Speaker. 2,500 permanent jobs in the Windsor area to operate this plant, 2,300 Canadian jobs to construct this plant. Those are the facts. He's risky, he's reckless, and he's just dealing in pure misinformation.
Again, I'd like to remind members to use language which doesn't impugn the member's use of information. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my information comes from the Windsor Police, who had a visit from the South Korean ambassador to set up the arrival of 1,600 South Korean replacement workers who will displace union workers in Windsor. Unions are up in arms as this government is displacing their workers to bring in replacement workers from abroad. So if anything I am saying is wrong, why doesn't the government just announce that they will release the contract to show any guarantees there are that the jobs will go to Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workforce Development.
Mr. Speaker, let's look at the facts and let's look at an authority in this matter, Mr. Speaker. Dave Cassidy, president of Union Local 444, calling out the disinformation from the Conservative Party as absolutely false and baseless. Mr. Speaker, there is simply no justification for what the ambassador of South Korea has suggested. 2,500 Canadian jobs to operate this plant, 2,300 Canadian jobs to construct this plant. Those are the facts. Those are the investments we're building for the future. Everything else is just risk and recklessness from the Conservatives.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
What is risky and reckless is to spend $15 billion, which works out to $1,000 for every family in Canada, for a project that will employ foreign replacement workers. Those workers will displace our union jobs in this country. In other words, our money for foreign workers. This is according to the police from Windsor, the local Windsor municipal government. These are the facts. And if the Prime Minister has any other facts he'd like to share, why won't he just give us the contract?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, let's get real. These Conservatives have never been for workers. They don't understand that the fight against climate change creates prosperity for generations to come. These once-in-a-generation investments in the Next Star facility is bringing 2,500 permanent jobs to Windsor, which is bringing back the auto industry. I don't know how you can spin this negatively. But it's beyond me that the Conservatives can somehow spin this negatively.
And ask all members, please, to only take the floor when they're recognized by the Speaker to do so, so that we can make sure that we have order in this House. J'aimerais reconnaître le député.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The economic update proves once again that the Prime Minister does not understand the word emergency. The housing crisis is an emergency. The new funding announced will be insufficient. Moreover, there's not a single new measure which will take effect before 2025, meaning after the next election. All that the Prime Minister is offering is money starting in 2025 if we vote in a Liberal government. When will the Prime Minister finally understand that what we need now, today, is money for housing, not campaign promises? The Honourable Housing, Communities and Infrastructure Minister.
I disagree with him, and I would encourage him to read the entirety of the fall economic statement. There's a number of measures that take effect very quickly, some in the next number of weeks, some in the next number of months. He must be referring to our recapitalization, though, of certain programs that are actually helping get homes built now. We continue to have funds on the table. In fact, just last week, we landed agreements worth $4 billion that's going to see nearly 12,000 new homes constructed right across this country at prices that ordinary people can actually afford. We are now locking in long-term investments that are going to provide certainty to builders so they can continue to build the homes that are necessary to defeat this housing crisis.
L'honorable député de Joliette.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He should read the charts in the budget. It says $0 for this year and $0 next year. Mr. Speaker and all, get your mittens and toques ready because it's going to be a long winter this year. A long winter for those who can't find housing and who won't see any new money until 2025. A long winter for those who might end up affected by the 50% increase in homelessness with no emergency fund to help. It's going to be a long one for media workers experiencing layoffs, but there's no emergency fund once again. And it's going to be a long one for SMEs if the emergency account repayment deadline is not extended beyond January. These people need help now, not in the spring, and especially not all the way in 2025. What's the Prime Minister waiting for?
The Honourable Housing Minister.
Monsieur Président,
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the member. It is necessary to invest in order to solve the housing crisis. There are new measures in the fall economic statement. For example, there are investments that our government is making that we had previously announced. For example, for the province of Quebec, there's $1.8 billion just to support affordable housing investments in the province of Quebec. We continue to make the necessary investments in order to put an end to the housing crisis everywhere in Canada.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister had a chance yesterday to cancel his plan to quadruple the carbon tax. It's important to understand how much he wants to raise taxes on Canadians. He wants to raise it up to 61 cents a litre. That will raise the cost of heat, gas, but also food, because when you tax the farmers who make the food and the truckers who ship the food, you tax all who buy the food. So will the Prime Minister finally tell us how much will it cost the average family when he quadruples the tax? And will he call an election on the carbon tax in order that Canadians can decide for themselves?
Yeah. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, the agri-food sector is affected probably more than any other sector by climate change. In a year when we saw increased floods and more frequent storms, when we saw soil erosion and sporadic and unpredictable rainfall, when we saw fires that went across this country, devastating rural communities, driving people out of their homes and causing destruction, it's really disappointing that the Conservatives still don't believe in climate change. All of those impacts result from climate change, and a price on pollution is working to reduce our emissions and fight that fight.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Only it's not working. They've missed every emissions target but one in the year that the economy was entirely locked down. This Liberal government ranks 58th out of 63 in the world, and their own Environment Commissioner says they will not meet their emissions targets. Yet they still go ahead with this carbon tax, which has proven not to work. So they want to quadruple the tax, including on farmers who have no other choice than to use traditional hydrocarbons to power their machinery, their barns, and their drying. So once again, how much will the carbon tax cost the average Canadian farmer when the Prime Minister quadruples it?
Here. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Conservatives were concerned about the cost of food and the cost of fuel, they would stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, because it is Russia's illegal war of aggression that is driving up global food prices and global fuel prices. But they are ideologically committed to ignoring climate change and doing anything that they could to possibly fight it, so much so that they throw Ukraine under the bus and vote against the very agreement that the Ukrainian government has asked Canada to support. Mr. Speaker, they need to give their head a shake, and they need to stand with the people who are fighting for freedom around this world.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The minister who stood and had a photo taken with a Nazi that helped Russian propaganda all around the world. But the question was about the carbon tax costs on the average Canadian farmer. I have here the power bill from Enbridge for a farm in my riding that is $11,000 in carbon taxes alone. That's today. Now the Prime Minister wants to quadruple the tax on Canadian farmers, which will drive up the cost of production, drive food growth out of this country, and drive prices up for everyday Canadian families. So once again, how much will the average farmer pay in carbon taxes once this Prime Minister implements his plan to quadruple the tax?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what is unbelievable is that for the Leader of the Opposition, who claims to stand for freedom, who claims to stand for democracy, will do everything he can to ideologically oppose fighting climate change, including not standing with Ukrainians who are facing an illegal war of aggression by Russia, Mr. Speaker. That is driving up food and fuel prices around the world. If he truly cared about supporting Canadian families, Canadian farmers, he would support the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and he wouldn't abandon them in their time of need.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Léonard, Saint-Michel. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, in its economic statement, the government announced measures to support housing cooperatives. Mr. Speaker, in Quebec, there are 1,130 co-ops, totaling over 22,000 units. The Leader of the Opposition has described co-op housing as Soviet-style housing, thus demonstrating his contempt for this type of housing. Can the Prime Minister explain to Canadians the impact that the measures announced yesterday will have on housing cooperatives everywhere in Canada? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Saint-Léonard Saint-Michel for her very hard work and for her question. People need more housing, and co-ops are part of the solution. That's why yesterday we announced that we are removing GST on the construction of new housing co-ops, and we also announced that we'll be strengthening our co-op development program. Mr. Speaker, unlike Leader of the Opposition, who has contempt for co-ops, we support them and we support everyone who lives there. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks.
The Prime Minister's tax on farmers who grow our food, the truckers who transport the food, it's a tax on all those who eat food, too. The Bloc Québécois wants to drastically increase taxes for farmers, Mr. Speaker. So there will be higher costs for farmers in Quebec. How much will this second carbon tax cost each farmer in Quebec? How much will it cost?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition and his party does not even have a climate plan. In this day and age, that is certainly very reckless. Last Monday, I had the privilege of dealing with Lisa Thompson, the Minister of Agriculture from Ontario, when we announced a $25 million plan in order to deal with climate change, in order to deal with innovation. I can tell the Leader of the Opposition, number one, you need a climate plan, and number two, this government will continue to support our farmers to make sure they stay on the cutting edge and become more profitable. If we do not deal with climate change, we add to the principle.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Their idea of helping farmers is putting in an $11,000 tax on one farm for 1 month. One farm, 1 month, $11,000. Now, they want to quadruple the tax on Canada's farmers. That will do nothing except for send the food production to more polluting foreign countries and forcing us to burn more diesel to transport it all the way back to Canada. So why don't they bring home food production and axe the tax on farmers?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Mr. Speaker, number one, we have a climate plan, and we will continue to deal with the climate plan. If we do not deal with climate, we increasingly put up the price of food. We have invested in farmers right across this country. We're going to make sure that farmers and ranchers stay on the cutting edge. We deal with climate change, because if we do not deal with climate change, like every country in the world is, we will continue to raise prices in the world.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, they still don't have a plan to fight climate change over there. What they have is a plan to quadruple a tax that has failed to fight climate change, giving Canada the 58th ranking out of 63 countries, missing every target but one in 8 years, and on track to miss their targets in 2030. So stop distracting from the real agenda here, which is to take money away from farmers, from food, and from the necessities of Canadian life. Will they, yes or no, announce their support for the Senate passing common sense Conservative Bill C-234 to take the tax off the farmers who feed us?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know who knows a thing or two about farming and climate change? That's the farmers who work in the breadbasket of the world, Ukrainian farmers. And you know who asked Canadian parliamentarians to vote for the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement? Ukrainian farmers. So did the Ukrainian-Canada Congress. So did President Zelensky himself. Ukrainian farmers are betrayed by this federal government. That's the people who grow.
Member from Scarborough Agincourt.
Mr. Speaker, economic reconciliation is a major part of the federal government's work to build a strong and sustainable economy. Yesterday, the government announced its fall economic statement. Can the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations inform the House on measures that support economic reconciliation?
The Honourable Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations.
I want to thank the member for Scarborough Agincourt for her tireless advocacy and her hard work. The number of major projects with potential for Indigenous equity ownership is anticipated to grow significantly over the next decade, and we're working with Indigenous partners to increase access to the affordable capital that Indigenous communities will require to make these opportunities a reality. This will make projects more economically feasible for Indigenous communities by decreasing the cost of capital. The Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program is a step in the right direction by the federal government on the path to economic reconciliation.
Order. The Honourable Member from Nunavut.
in the fall economic statement, the Liberals showed that they are ending critical programs and services that Indigenous peoples rely on. These decisions will keep Indigenous peoples in poverty. This at a time when the First Nations infrastructure gap stands at $350 billion. When will this government use this empathy they express and reconcile that with the funding so desperately needed to lift Indigenous peoples out of poverty?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really appreciate the advocacy of the member opposite to continue our work to close the infrastructure gap and to seek true reconciliation with Indigenous people. And that's a journey we've been on, Mr. Speaker, since 2015. In fact, services for Indigenous people were flatlined for over a decade with the previous Conservative government. We've seen an increase of 168% in investments in Indigenous communities, and we're not going to stop, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The horror, the nightmare. Imagine leaving your home. You've got a crying newborn in the back seat. You're making your way through smoke you can hardly see, and you're trying to find an evacuation route from fires. This was the situation for thousands of people in the Northwest Territories this summer, and yet through climate inaction and through a failure to fund essential infrastructure in the North, Canadian communities will experience this more often. When will the Prime Minister follow through on commitments for essential infrastructure, especially for evacuation and fire preparedness in our North?
Yep. The Honourable Minister.
Devastating wildfires in Northwest Territories caused extremely large evacuation and impacted many homes. I visited the area. I am speaking with my counterpart for what the actual needs are, visiting also the Indigenous communities. Infrastructure, including roads and even telecommunication lines, is the topics that we are currently discussing. We will make sure that the North gets the support that they need. Thank you.
And that brings an end to question period. I see that there are a number of members who are rising on a point of order. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And during question period, I heard in one of the questions from the Leader of the Opposition his reckless use of the word crazy as a pejorative for one of our cabinet ministers. Mr. Speaker, the use of the word crazy is offensive and stigmatizing, and as so many Canadians.
I thank the Minister for raising this issue. The Speaker already had made a statement regarding this and the importance of when we're referring to individual members, that we treat all members with respect and dignity. Also on a point of order, je vois le HoC.
The member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie on a point of order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek unanimous consent for the following motion. Given that the construction of Mirabel Airport led to the forced expropriation of thousands of people in 1969. Families lost their homes, their land, and their communities. As a result, they've been traumatized. And given the end of commercial flights to Mirabel, and the fact that the airport is now closed to the public, that this House officially apologized to residents of Mirabel who were expropriated in 1969. All those opposed to the honourable member's motion will please say nay.
Je regrette.
Unfortunately, there is no unanimous consent. On another point of order, the honourable member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, there were consultations among the parties, and I think you'll find there's unanimous consent for the following motion, that the House, considering the joint statement by Ontario and Quebec premiers on November 17th about replacing the Aurora by the federal government, that there be a call for tenders before any contract is entered into for the replacement of this multi-mission aircraft. All those opposed to the honourable member's motion will please say nay.
Il n'y en a pas de cons.
There is no unanimous consent.
Appel, a point of order, the honourable member from Fort Saskatchewan, Sherwood Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just in response to the point of order from the member for Thunder Bay, Superior North, I do want to draw the attention of the House to the fact that on February 23rd, 2016, that member used the same word in quite the same context.
Yeah, all right.
That is falling into the issue of debate. Thank you to the member. Comme il est 15 heures.
It being.
Excuse me, I did not see the honourable member from Winnipeg Centre rising on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, during QP, the leader of the Conservative Party referred to the Environment Minister as crazy Environment Minister. We are going through a mental health crisis in this country. I would like the member from Carleton to apologize to this House and apologize to people struggling with mental health across this country.
I thank the member from Winnipeg Centre for raising his point of order. The Speaker did point this out during the question period of the importance of using language that is respectful in regards to in respect to members, individual members of this House, and on top of that, the member to which was referred to is not in the House to rise, or is not available. Sorry, I can't do that. So I caught myself on this. We are going to be moving on. Appel au règlement.
On a point of order, the honourable member for Madawaska-Restigouche. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's become impossible to hear questions and answers, and especially the answers. It's always from the same corner of this House where the heckling is coming from. There is supposed to be decorum around parliamentary language, and this is a perfect illustration of my point. The language has changed here. Some of our colleagues are using disdainful language, they're bullying, they're shouting, and I think as members of Parliament, each one of us here has a right to hear clearly without feeling intimidated. We have a right to hear the answers. I'd like to hear your ruling on how decorum should be respected and parliamentary language. It's gotten to the point that it makes no sense anymore. I'd like to thank the honourable member for Madawaska-Restigouche for his intervention. As you all know, the chair has already made observations and given guidance to members on how to conduct ourselves more respectfully. Now, while at the same time acknowledging that there will be passionate, heated, excited debate here in the House. Today is a day, it's Wednesday, so it's not uncommon for members from all political parties to get a bit more riled up, a bit more excited, if I could put it that way. But I agree. It's important for everyone to respect, for us all to respect each other. And when one member has the floor, we should all be quiet and allow that person to speak. It's very important. And in the case, the specific case, the chair did hear the member's answer, but I would encourage all members to exercise much more self-restraint, much more discipline, so that everyone can be heard here in the House.
Oui. Thank you. Thank you. Je reconnais l'honorable.
I recognize the member for Esquimalt-Saanich-Sooke.
With respect, I think if you examine the proceedings today, you will see that the point of order raised by the member for Winnipeg Centre is about the use of the term crazy referring to someone's mental health as a pejorative. It doesn't matter who it's applied to in this House. Her point of order was about the use of that term as a pejorative. And I think you, Mr. Speaker, may have inadvertently confirmed that negative thing in your ruling. And so I would like the Speaker to examine those records, because I think we need to make sure that in this House we respect all those Canadians who are struggling with mental health issues and not use mental health as a pejorative in this House.
Thanks. I thank the member, and I will take a closer look at that point of intervention from the member from Winnipeg Centre. But I do see that the